Welcome to Story Hour, a virtual meetup hosted by Wolf and Heron.
My grandma is about 4'11" when she's standing, but her knees are weak after a lifetime of use and abuse. Her favorite pastime now is to drive electric carts at Costco. And of course, she's doing this on a Saturday or a Sunday at the busiest time of day, most likely after church is let out, with no other regard for other people's needs. When she first immigrated to the US, she was a seamstress, and her fingers were not so nimble. So the clothes, I don't know if they were ever sold, but she worked really hard and saved up for her first investment in the United States, which was a green sewing machine. And this green sewing machine ran on oil, and she used this with all of the fabric that she had accumulated over time to make her kids' clothes and her grandkids' clothes and all the clothes of the people around her. She had two daughters, and the daughter with more nimble fingers, she encouraged her to type and have a career in the corporate world. Her younger daughter, she encouraged to go to school so that she can pursue a career, and now she's also happily retired. I vividly remember wearing one of these handmade shirts from that bag of fabric. I dressed up as a Jack-in-the-Box for Halloween, and I was wearing a painted old TV box. I had lipstick paint on my cheeks, and on my top I was wearing a retro colored striped shirt with sewn on lace. And I actually won first place in that costume contest. My grandma, she was a traditional Chinese dancer in China. She traveled with a national dance company. She met her husband and continued to dance after she had two baby girls. But this all changed. During the Cultural Revolution. Artists and dancers like her were forced to change their careers. And she found herself with her two daughters working on a farm as farm laborers in rural South China and not traveling the cities anymore. Her limber joints, they became less conditioned, and now she had to tend to rural fields instead of her experience on stage. She couldn't fathom a future in which her and her two daughters would grow up a life working in labor, and really wanted to badly change this future for them. Well, she had a brother living in the States that sponsored their immigration. You know, her eldest at the time, she required immigration paperwork. And so her eldest, who was my mother, had to stay in China while she filed and processed that paperwork. She and our younger daughter, my aunt, fled or moved to Hong Kong to wait for her eldest. They stayed in a one-bedroom apartment so close to her neighbors across the way. She oftentimes describes it that she would hear rats scurrying up in between the building walls. Mm. She waited and waited for her eldest, and during the day, she bought fabric. And that was the currency she was going to use when she came to the States. She bought the striped fabric, the flower printed, the lace, the linens, and the chiffons. And the 4 months waiting in Hong Kong were excruciating. There were deadlines, there were papers, there was legal logistics. My grandma continued to network with diplomats so that she can expedite her daughter's release. And when the three of the girls, women, finally flew to New York, it was August. It was hot. And actually, it was just days before my mother turned 18, in which case she would not have been able to immigrate without, being part of my grandma's family. So in the United States, she returned back to Chinese dancing. She brought the illegal arts to the Chinese immigrant community in New York. She helped start up the traditional Chinese dance school in Chinatown and taught young children how to dance. She used the fabric in that bag and her sewing seamstress skills to outfit the children in their dance, glued sequences on the tough skirts and lace fabric. and the children all smiled in their dancing headbands. For one season, I also helped play a flower on stage and wore green chiffon and twirled red ribbons alongside my grandmother on stage. I remember getting a standing ovation from that crowd. So now my grandmother, she is 92. Her knees are weak. She loves going to Costco, but every time I visit her, I still see that bag of fabric that she pulls out, and now she's not using she's not no longer using the sewing machine because it's broken, but instead sews scarves for my dog so that she can run around in the field having free and fun.
Thank you, Antonia.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
That was so fun. What was powerful about that story? What should Antonia hold on to? Molly.
I felt like I loved your story. Thank you for sharing that. And I loved how deeply I could feel the connection you have to your family. And so I would definitely hold on to that and also play it up as you continue to refine this story. Even in some of the anecdotes you share, really carving out those scenes is a way of that you were able to share your connection instead of just telling us you have a connection. And so I definitely would hang on to that. I love that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Abednego.
I think the story of our grandmother coming from China, immigrating in the United States, is something that's very powerful indeed, and raising two daughters at the same time and while navigating life and trying to pursue the goal and visions for which you held in China and that of coming into the United States. So I think they transitioned from as an immigrant into the United States and also raising children along with her husband, and also seeing how best to continue to fulfill her dreams and passions as a dancer and also helping the kids. I think that is very essential and important regarding the story as well. It's very good.
Thank you.
I thought you did a really great job of inviting curiosity. And I'm trying to think, what was it that did that for me? I think the characters, including and especially your grandma, were just so interesting. So interesting. And it's some of the details that you include in order to help us see them a little bit, but be curious and want to know more. Like the fact, the details about the lace things and her knees and Costco, just there's aspects of that are make her out to be this fascinating character. And then wondering what's going to happen in the story. How do you get from A to Z? And you just took us through that so nicely, without providing also every single answer. And so there's always this balance when you're crafting a story in terms of what is the right level of detail, how much to include, especially because you're kind of walking us through decades in a way. But it felt yes, like you included many details, but it wasn't overwhelming. And it was enough to paint a picture, but not feel like we were just super surface level. So I thought that was very nice. Other thoughts from folks? What should Antonia hold on to? Yes, Ellie.
I think the part that astonished me the most, was almost jaw dropping, was when you said, and it was right when I think it was your mother about to or almost turned 18, which would have really made the process more difficult for her. So I really liked that, and just kind of knowing that all the things that they went through and things like that. I didn't realize it was such a time constraint until you said that, and then I was like, oh wow, that if it would have been any longer than it would have been a lot harder of a process. So even if you wanted to add some more suspense before that. Cause it really like made my jaw drop even with that. And so I was like, oh my goodness. Yeah, and it was a really good story overall. Just hearing about your grandmother's life, and yeah, it was really good and really inspiring to, make what you can out of what you have.
Thank you, Ellie. Actually, that part, there's a lot of jaw dropping things that my grandma likes to talk about all the dramas in her life. But that one is the jaw dropping part. And I was really struggling without telling all the details to consolidate it, but to still create that sort of like, oh my goodness aspect. And I have to refine, but thank you for catching on to that, Ellie, because that was my intent, was to have that as part of the urgency, right? Like to weave that in as part of the urgency. So thanks for catching that. I was a little bit afraid.
Melissa.
Hi, Antonia. It was so interesting to hear the story of your grandmother as well. And I loved hearing in the second half about her work as a dancer and being in the arts. And I think it could be really powerful to kind of leave some droppings in the first half of your story where you're talking about her body being very frail and sorry, it's really windy outside.
Okay.
Heavily used, because that would help connect the front half of your story and the back half of your story and make sense as to why you started with the end of her life and not just doing it sequentially.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. And in terms of experiments, that was one of the things that I was noodling on as I was listening is what are other chronologies that you could, or orders that you could tell the story in, and how would that change how the story feels? What would it do to tell it from like beginning to end versus starting at Costco and like starting at today and ending at today? I don't know which one's better, but that's something that's certainly like a full-on experiment that you could try to just do it in order. Other thoughts on experiments, or Carol, if you have kudos, you can share that as well.
Oh, great. Yeah, I was wondering if you incorporated like the word for fabric in your grandmother's native tongue somehow. Just it was a thought that occurred to me as you were reading it.
That's interesting. Thank you. I can play around with that. It'll show how disconnected I am from from real Chinese traditions, not being able to say it properly. But and I'm glad that you caught on to that, because I was trying to find weave in a couple of themes, and I know it's kind of pretty blatant, but the fabric one was the one theme that I put.
I like the way how you mentioned fabric in the beginning and then tied it up at the end with fabric as well. That was great. And the bag of fabric, don't you just want to like get the bag of fabric and run your fingers through it and see the colors and the textures, and I don't know. That's me. I really enjoyed the story. Yeah.
The discussion that you two just had, though, does bring to mind for me like you not being sure, Antonia, if you want to include that language, is that this story, the way that you're telling it, is and can be from your perspective, even though you're walking us through your grandma's experience, and in some respects your mom's. So it would make sense that there is that you are a little bit distant from the literal experience of your grandma, who could, I'm sure, perfectly speak in her native language. And you are then kind of like learning and interpreting from her experience and what she has shared with you. You could think about in some ways too, in the story, like, how did you learn of all of this history? Where were you sitting when she shared all of this with you? Because it's so rich, and what were some of your feelings? And you can think about making that relationship of how you discovered this more part of what you share in the story, and bring, in some ways that would bring you into it even more, and help us see, you know, the relationship between you and your grandma, how you feel about her, how you feel about this life that she's led, and the courage and journey that she's been on. And I mean, I think that would be really interesting as someone who knows you as well. Molly.
I was going to say, for an experiment, and please correct me if I'm misremembering, but there was a point kind of in the middle of your story where you talk about your grandma's transition from being a dancer to farming. And I would have loved like a more dedicated space to like really call that out. And I was even thinking like, if you got in with some like techniques of dancing and comparing them to techniques of farming, and just like really like showcase the transition she went through, because it's identity, it's livelihood, and it's different, I'm sure, for her. And we don't know what that was like, only she does, but it like deserves a moment, I feel like.
Thank you. Yeah. I was nervous about all the different facts in there, but as I was telling it, I was thinking something similar, which is to make that, to have more imagery there, and make that sort of dichotomy more prevalent.
I love how much you know about your grandma. Awesome.
Yeah, she was my favorite person in 4th grade. I have a poster.
I love it. Thank you, Antonia. Thank you, everyone, for your feedback.
Visit wolfandheron.com to find out more about our story hours.